Welcome to Friday. I hope you are looking forward to a great weekend. And we are all the way up to chapter 6 in the Gospel of Mark. And so we've seen Jesus come on the scene. We've seen him get in trouble with the Pharisees and with the religious leaders, Pharisees, with the Herodians, the political leaders. We see all kinds of things happening as his identity begins to be revealed back to the world. And speaking of identity, have you ever gone home to preach?
Yeah, I think about this all the time. If my high school friends, the ones who I've stayed in touch with, the ones you go back to a reunion, and they look and say, "And you're a what?"
Yeah.
And I say, "Yeah, I'm about this pastor." They're like,
one of
they get a good snicker out of that.
One of our native writers in North Carolina, Thomas Wolfe, is best known for his statement, "You can't go home again."
Right.
And I don't know, we can get into what that may mean or may not mean, but one of the things that happens here in chapter 6 is Jesus goes home. Back to Nazareth, the small town in which he grew up, where everybody would have known him. Everybody would have known more about him than he knew. And it reads, chapter 6, he left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown, and among their own kin, and in their own house." And he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief.
So
not a great homecoming.
Yeah. So sometimes the familiarity, if we know someone and we know who they are, we know their little childhood stories, and we think they can't grow beyond those. It's fascinating to think that these people see Jesus just as that same little boy that they knew, and now he's doing all these amazing things, and he's got quite the reputation, and everybody's following him around. But we know who he is. He's Mary and Joseph's boy. We know his brothers and sisters. We watched him change his diapers growing up.
And it is interesting that his ability to do things is hampered by their attitude.
Yeah.
It seems to be, anyway.
So often it is really true that in order to be able to do much of anything, you have to have belief. If you are a sports person, you'll often hear coaches, announcers talk about if a team actually has belief, if they have this confidence, remarkable things can happen. If they're on the same page, they're all pulling together, teams really flourish in those times. And conversely, Steve, if there's not belief...
That's my problem with golf. To stand up on the tee and I don't think positive. I don't believe it's going to go right down the middle. I believe it's going to shank into the woods.
Yeah, so the power of belief is a remarkable thing. And here Jesus says, Mark says Jesus couldn't do a lot of things because there wasn't belief in the town.
In some of the other gospel accounts, they will even actually try to kill Jesus. But overall, what I mean, at the heart of this story is that Jesus is rejected. We didn't talk about this yesterday in the healing of Jairus' daughter, but he's laughed at when he says she's still asleep. So he's laughed at, he's rejected. But yet, and here's the thing with Jesus, is resiliency. He doesn't stop because someone rejected him. He doesn't give up his work because someone laughed at him. How many of us have stopped short of accomplishing something amazing because somebody discouraged us and we gave up?
And conversely, when somebody believed in us and said, "I think you can do that.
Yeah.
I think you got this."
You can push. It really does matter. The back to golf, if you remember, Bobby Jones said the hardest yardage on the golf course is the 4.5 inches between your ears. It really does matter. Belief, faith, hope, the positive thinking. I'm not a Robert Schuller here or Vincent Norman Peale, but there's something about having that internal drive and conviction that you can do it, that helps accomplish amazing things.
Before we leave chapter 6, I do want to talk about the death of John the Baptist. It is so interesting for me in Mark's gospel. John the Baptist is really the beginning of the good news. John's laying the groundwork. And then this critical moment in which John dies. John is not a shrinking violet, as they say. John was out and calling the spade a spade. And he upsets Herod, and then has this scene where this woman says that she wants the head of John the Baptist on a platter.
Yeah, it's Herod's stepdaughter, basically.
Yeah, Herod's stepdaughter.
And he had run. Anyway, it read that, because it will give you an insight into the brutality of the first century.
Yeah.
That people wielded this kind of power where they could arbitrarily decide they wanted someone's head on a platter just because they happened to be a certain position of power. There's no rights, there's no constitution, there's no lawyers or advocacy. It's just, Herod on a whim. What do you want? I'll give you anything. You did a great job with your dance. I want John the Baptist head on a platter for my mom. Okay, we'll make it happen.
And this grieves Herod. And but I think this is one of those moments where, again, Mark spills a great deal of ink to tell this story, and it will have a profound impact on the ministry of Jesus from here on out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, chapter 6 is pivotal because you come into it with the rejection of Jesus. Rather than quit, Jesus expands his ministry, right? So you can look at it as the first story of the rejection is a setback for Jesus, but Jesus doesn't stop. He expands his ministry. He sends out the 12. The next story, the death of John the Baptist, that would be enough to make a lot of people quit. The rejection would be a lot enough to make people quit. But when the rejection comes, when the setback comes, when the threat becomes real, rather than step back, Jesus steps forward. And so after the death of John the Baptist, you see Jesus, we get two of the most famous miracles that Jesus will work, the feeding of the 5,000 and walking on water.
Which is told in all four of the Gospels. One of the few stories. John doesn't have a lot of the stories that we have in the other, but the feeding of the 5,000 is a fascinating story.
And so I hope you can kind of see what's happening here. It's almost like as the opposition to what Jesus is doing increases, Jesus ups his game. The opposition then ups their game, and then Jesus goes even farther.
And I think all of us, I'm sure you've heard a lot of sermons on the stories of the feeding of 5,000, and you try to process and think, this is an odd story, 5 loaves and 2 fishes. What does this say about the nature of Jesus and his ministry? And I think for me, one of the things that I've always drawn from this is this capacity of God who can take the ordinary, 5 loaves and 2 fishes and do remarkable stuff with it. And I think the call always is for us is to not look at the limited resources that we think we have, but instead focus on the real power of God, who can take 2 ordinary country boys that have no business being pastors of churches, standing up before people, doing much of anything, and even saying to us, fellas, I'm going to use you. I can show you that the ordinariness that you are, we'll have people who will hear good news even through you. I think those are pretty remarkable things that God can do.
Yeah, and continues to do. And this is, again, what's one of Mark's themes? The kingdom of God is at hand. Jesus manifests that kingdom. One of the images of the Messiah, of the day of the Lord, of God's presence is providing. Just as God provided for the Israelites in the wilderness, seemingly out of nothing, Jesus provides for the crowds out of nothing, essentially. And then the fact that Jesus demonstrates at the last of this, walking on the water, has power over the elements.
Yeah, and they never seem to be able to make the connection that Jesus did do this, a miracle, feeding the 5,000, and the ways that Jesus could even bless their ordinary lives and do things. It's even with all of this remarkable evidence of the power of God, I still doubt, we still doubt, we all still have our doubts.
And so here's something to take into the weekend. Just want to end with reading in chapter 6, when Jesus comes to them in verse 50. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." So that's a pretty good thing to take into the weekend. Yeah. Whatever you're facing, no matter what kind of storm you may have in your own life or whatever kind of needs you may have in your own life, to take this chapter 6 to see that even in the midst of rejection, even in the midst of threat, Jesus finds a way to provide for the needs of the people who follow him and to be present with them in the storms of life and help them to not be afraid.
That's a good closing word. Thank you for joining us. We look forward as we walk through this Gospel of Mark. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.